Good morning. Welcome to Connection Valley Church on Zoom. We're so glad that you've decided to spend a few minutes with us, around an hour together today. Our mission at Connection Valley is to influence people to life-giving connections with Jesus, their family, and the community. And one of the ways that we do that is we partner with a local organization in our community that's already doing great work. And we just come alongside and try to offer support for what they are already doing. And our community partner for this month is the Baptist Children's Home of North Carolina. It's a group housing, I guess, for orphans. And so we are partnering with them this month, and we're also physically bringing gifts for those kids. So it's one of the ways that we are trying to influence those life-giving connections in our community. Last month, we were partnered with Family Room, which is a foster care resource center. And I was able to deliver some gift cards to them and some shelving to them yesterday. And they were so excited and so blown away by the generosity of you guys. So for all of you who give so that we are able to do things like that in our community, you are making a difference. And these people who work so tirelessly in organizations like that, where they see people hurting on a regular basis, for you guys to be generous with your giving, we're able to be such an encouragement to them. And I could see the employees. I do most of my communication with the owner of the organization, but when we dropped off those shelves, we were able to see a lot of the volunteers. They're regular volunteers who spend a lot of hours, and there's like, we've heard about you. We've heard so much about your church. So you guys just need to know that you are making an impact in the community in ways that sometimes we don't get to hear about. So it was just fun to get to hear that from them yesterday. And so North Carolina, or the Baptist Children's Home of North Carolina, is our partner for this month. So anytime someone comes for the first time, we make a $10 donation on their behalf. And so then we look for other ways that we can partner with them physically, just to kind of be that support system for them in the community. So lots of good opportunities coming up in the next weeks and months that we're really excited about. But I wanted you to know, pass along that message from Carrie at the Family Room so that you would know. We are starting a new series today, Great Expectations. Our Christmas services too, I do want to mention this again one more time. On December 23rd, it's a Thursday evening, 6 o'clock Eastern time, in person, 7:30 Eastern time on Zoom. We would love to have you join us. We would love to have you invite friends. And I'm seeing a note in the chat. How can you donate from out of state? You can either send gift cards, or you could send money. I'll get with you in the chat in a little bit, or you could send a gift if you want, but I know shipping is kind of a pain. But if you were to order online, you could just have it shipped to our address, would be a way to do that if you were to order on Amazon, for example. But I'll get with you in the chat about ways that you can donate if you would like to as well. Thank you for that. Love it. As I said, we are starting a new series today, Great Expectations, as we celebrate this month the birth of Jesus. Very excited about that. And to get us started, Jim is going to lead us in a song, which I'm excited about. So I'm handing it over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Mayberry. It was interesting this morning when I saw Jim at our in-person service. He was telling me that he wasn't sure if his voice was going to be there today, but I'm going to tell you, man, you bring it every week. And like I told you then, I'll tell you now, we greatly appreciate you and you offering your gifts and talents the way that you do. Now, the other thing I wanted to share with you before I really get rolling into what I was planning to talk about today is when I had the inspiration for this series a few weeks ago called Great Expectations. I had no idea the first week would be on the other side of a horrible loss by my favorite football team. And it just made me think about how oftentimes we have these great expectations of what will be, but they just don't come true. So don't feel sorry for me. It's not the most important thing in my life, I think, but it's been an interesting last 12 hours and getting text from people and communication from people that has been, let's just say, interesting. So anyway, we're starting this new series and I want to ask you a question and get us rolling here. Do you have a favorite Christmas movie that maybe you watch every year? For instance, Elf is one I know that we've seen quite a bit over the years. We don't necessarily watch it every year, but Elf may be a favorite Christmas movie for you. How about Christmas Vacation? I'm going to throw out a few of these here. So if you want to weigh in the chat and just let us know what your favorite is, go for it. Christmas Vacation is one that people quote quite often, and I won't do that right now, but you can probably hear the voices in your head. How about the movie Home Alone? A lot of people watch Home Alone in my household. That's one that goes back to my kids' childhood and one I know that they really like. And then there are movies like It's a Wonderful Life. Great message. The acting isn't always so great, but great message there. I saw Sherry mentioned that she said there's a lovely cartoon on Amazon called Snowman. I see from Danielle and Lily, Christmas Chronicles and The Santa Claus. Okay, those are some good choices right there. I'm going to throw out a couple more. Someone this morning mentioned Die Hard. I never really considered Die Hard a Christmas movie. I did, obviously it comes out at Christmas time, but I never really said, no, Die Hard's a Christmas movie. But maybe you put that in the category of movies. There's also How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and that's always been a favorite for me. And then last, but certainly not least, A Christmas Story. And I think part of the reason why I like A Christmas Story is the time in my life when it was released. And then also the 9-year-old character, Ralphie. For whatever reason, I resonated with him as a kid. I look back at it now as an adult and I laugh because Ralphie's kind of a dork. But as a kid that was about 9 years old at the same time, I related a lot to Ralphie. And we talked last year about his dream to have the Red Ryder BB gun. And that's a theme that runs throughout the movie. And an expectation he had that ultimately we know, and this is not a spoiler alert because you've probably seen this movie, that he got what he wanted. His expectation was fulfilled. But before that expectation was fulfilled, he had another expectation. And maybe you remember he liked the radio show Little Orphan Annie. And Little Orphan Annie had a decoder pin that you could get in the mail. And then there was like this buildup for this special message that this decoder pin would help you unpack. And so there's a scene in the movie where he can't wait to find out what this secret special message is, only to find out that it's an advertisement for Ovaltine, reminding him to drink his Ovaltine. And Ralphie was, let's just say, disheartened by the delivery on that expectation. And I bring that up because we know what it's like to have an expectation that maybe is up here, but the delivery is down here. To hope for something better than what actually is delivered. And we experience that in a lot of arenas in life. But one of the arenas in life that we want to have high expectations and have those expectations met is at Christmas time in our relationships. Like, I can ask you what you want for Christmas and you may have some stuff in mind, but ultimately you want your relationships to be good. And the reason that is, you guys know this already, but I'm going to say it, is that our lives will never be better than the quality of our relationships. Have you ever thought about that before? That our lives will never be better than the quality of our relationships. You can have the stuff, you can have the status that we talked about in the last series, but your life will never be better than the quality of your relationships. The ones you have at home, that's where it all kind of begins. The ones you have at work or at school, with your teacher, with your boss, with your coworkers, with your employees. If those relationships are bad, you feel them in other areas. And so this Christmas, we want to talk about how we can make those relationships the best they can possibly be. But that can be absolutely exhausting when you think about all the people you may relate with or interact with, and the kind of history maybe you have with those people. And I wrote down some of these people you may interact with or relate to or spend time with over the next few weeks. Maybe you already saw them at Thanksgiving too. But I share this list with you of people because it can be exhaustive and it can be exhausting, especially as you think about the expectations that are going to be there. So let's take a roll here at it, or take a stab at all these relationships. Some of you'll be relating with your husband, maybe your ex-husband, or your wife, or your ex-wife, or your sons, or your stepsons, or your daughters, or your stepdaughters, or your mothers, your stepmothers, your mother-in-laws, your fathers, your stepfathers, your father-in-laws, your brothers, your stepbrothers, your sisters, your stepsisters, your grandmothers, your stepgrandmothers, your grandfathers, stepgrandfathers, aunts, uncles, first cousins. And let me just quick public service announcement. Don't want to date and marry your first cousin, because we actually know somebody who did that. That's just not a good idea for multiple reasons, but no need to chase that rabbit. Friends, boyfriends, fiancés, neighbors, teachers, and bosses. And the list could actually go on and on and on. And when I read that, how does that feel? How does that land with you? Just a few moments ago, I was speaking with someone in a small group from the first service, and they were talking about how they resonated so much with that list because they said, that's my life. That's me. And we may not have all those dynamics going on, but most of us have a portion of those dynamics going on. And with the expectations that we have of those people and those people have of us, it can create a lot of pressure because the expectations are so great. And I want to create some or share some scenarios with you of what maybe you've experienced in the past that maybe make you feel pressure, or that this year is going to just be like all the other years. Like, for instance, you ever have a family member, maybe an uncle, maybe a brother or a brother-in-law, and they can't stop talking about themselves. Like, you start to try to share in a conversation cooperatively, and they just take it over. And there's no, like, what I call throwing the ball back. It's just like a monologue. And so you just find yourself not wanting to even try to engage the conversation anymore because they won't shut up. There's no questions. There's no natural flow. And so it's easy to just kind of drift off into feeling miserable, like you're stuck and you can't wait to get away. Or do you ever have this dynamic happen? You have family together and you maybe see each other once or twice a year. If you're really lucky, 3 times, but people can't get off their cell phone. Like, they're just either doing this, or they're doing this, or they're doing this. And it's just like, okay, I only see you like twice a year. I know Facebook is really interesting. Like, there's so many great things to see on Facebook, but can't we at least, while we're like present, be together? And I know I'm probably sounding a little bit older just saying that statement in itself, but a lot of you understand what I'm saying when I say that, because you've experienced that. Or how about like the situation where you have the dad or the grandfather or the son, and all they want to do is watch sports. Like, it's just like this incessant sports marathon. And so, like, almost like an escape, they just watch sports. And it's like, how do you watch football that long? Well, I can tell you how you watch football that long, because I really like football, but it can seem really excessive and really detrimental to the relationship, because there's not any real interaction about anything that matters. Or while we're having fun here, how about the passive aggressive comments from an in-law? Have you ever experienced that before? And you're thinking, okay, what does that mean? And you can't really read the tea leaves. You don't really understand what they're saying, but you know it's not good. I was just talking to a friend this past week who at his Thanksgiving, they experienced this kind of dynamic, and he would leave the room and his wife would be there with her family, and they would say things that they wouldn't say in front of him because he would stand up for her, but she wouldn't stand up for herself. It was driving him absolutely nuts. Or how about this? How about the boss that wants you to work late over the holidays? Because maybe they don't have a family or friends to go to or spend time with. And so they think it all revolves around the business. And you got to stay late at work because, well, they don't get it. Or how about the teacher that gives you a bunch of homework? Isn't that fun? No, not really. It's awful. Or how about the brother who won't discipline his kids properly? At least in your opinion, right? But they run around like savages, and when they eat at the table for the Christmas meal, they talk and they eat at the same time, like their mouths are mwah, and it's disgusting. They're like goats eating at the Christmas table, and it's like, I did not come here to watch goats or people acting like goats, eating like goats at the Christmas table at my house or your house or their house. Or how about this? How about the grandfather who doesn't say much, but he seems annoyed the whole time? And this doesn't just have to be the grandfather; it can be anybody. But you're around people and they just seem mad. It's uncomfortable. Or this will be my last one because there's so many of these scenarios that we could talk about because you've experienced them, I've experienced them. How about the family members that are measuring the amount of time you spent with one family and making sure you spend at least that much time with them? That's really life-giving, right? No, it's not. I use sarcasm sometimes as a coping mechanism. We all understand what it's like to have these kind of expectations, and they are soul sucking, life taking. And so what we know, what you know, what I know is that we can't control other people. That some of the very scenarios I just shared with you, or some maybe you thought about, are more than likely going to happen. And before we even talk about that any further, what are the expectations that people have of you? And when I say expectations of you, what expectations do they have of you that you're going to be a certain way? That maybe you're going to be a critic, or maybe you're going to be the one eating like a goat. I hope not, but it happens, or whatever it may be. What are their expectations of you? I want to ask a couple more questions in light of that. Do you feel the weight of those expectations at all? And then the last question I want to ask before we really unpack this further is, how can we make this Christmas better than the previous ones? How can we make this Christmas better than the previous ones as we manage these expectations that oftentimes are up here, but deliver down here, both good and bad? Like, how can we actually make it a great Christmas? And to help us process this, I want to hit the rewind button and first go back 4,000 years from right now. 4,000 years ago, there's a guy on the scene named Abraham who was a nomad. He was wandering around the Middle East, and God spoke to him and gave him some very clear direction and promised him a land, but even bigger than that, he promised Abraham that all nations would be blessed through his lineage. So when Abraham had his son Isaac, and Isaac had his son Jacob, who became known as Israel, and then he had lots of sons, but his son Judah, they ended up leading all the way down to the ultimate Messiah, Jesus, who came for all people. So 4,000 years behind now, God had a plan then for right now, which kind of blows my mind because God is beyond time and we're not, and we're confined by time. But that just sets the groundwork for where we're going. going back 2,700 years, so 700 years before the first century and when Jesus came, there was a lot happening in the world and a lot happening in the Middle East and a lot happening in Israel and specifically in Jerusalem. And 700 years before the first century, before Jesus came, there was a prophet named Isaiah. And Isaiah got the fun job to tell everyone how God was going to judge their rebellion and disobedience. At the same time, thank goodness his message just wasn't about God's judgment on rebellion and disobedience, but it also contained God's provision for us in the middle of our sin and disobedience and rebellion. And so we're going to talk about some of what Isaiah said. First, more the gloomy side, because he's prophesying to a group of people who are rebelling and sinning against God and rejecting God about what's going to happen to them. And while we don't maybe specifically identify with what they experienced, we can understand some of the emotion that they experienced based on things we have done, or maybe things we haven't done, things that other people have done to us, because we live in a broken world. But in Isaiah chapter 8, it's where we're going to hang out. We're going to kind of bounce around Isaiah chapter 8 and then chapter 9 and then chapter 7. So roll with me here, but if you have a Bible and you want to look along with me, we're going to be in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 21 and verse 22, talking about the judgment that's going to come for the Israelites for the rebellion against God 700 years before Jesus came. So Isaiah said, speaking to them, distressed and hungry, they will roam through the land. So he's describing what their condition is going to be like as a result of the judgment. So distressed and hungry, they will roam through the land. When they are famished, they will become enraged, and looking upward will curse their king and their God. And then they will look toward the earth and only see distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. Now, I can speak for myself. That's hardcore. I cannot imagine having to speak that message to people who are in a rebellious and disobedient bent mindset, lifestyle, but he spoke this message. And 700 years before Jesus came, what they didn't know is that about 100 years after that, so 600 years before Jesus came, that they would be experiencing these conditions. I'm so thankful Isaiah didn't finish his message here. And we see in a couple other places, and there's several throughout the book of Isaiah, but we can't possibly cover all that today. There are a couple other places where Isaiah speaks to how God is going to come through, how he's going to bring healing to the hurt, what he's going to do to make a way and a provision in the middle of, well, their rebellion and ultimately our rebellion, being a blessing for all nations through the lineage of Abraham that goes back 4,000 years from today. So you tracking, you following? That's a lot right there. It's all kind of all over the place. But in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, we see part of the promise of God to come through for us and for the nation of Israel. He says, therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel. So this is a prophecy to the virgin birth of Jesus, but also a prophecy that Jesus, the Messiah, which is coming, they don't know when at this point, is going to be known as God with us, which is what Emmanuel means. That's substantial because what Isaiah is saying 700 years before it happens is that God is going to be coming to earth to be like us, to be with us. He's going to be God with skin on, Jesus being God with skin on. That's a powerful statement before it even happened, 700 years before it happened. And then in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, this might be another verse that you're familiar with if you've been around the church at any point in time. But Isaiah says, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. Now, I just want to talk about that for a few moments. The government will be on his shoulders. When they heard that, I imagine that they were thinking, based on what we see later, is that the Messiah was going to come as a conquering avenger. He was going to make things right when they were wrong. And what we know that happens 100 years later after these prophecies is that the nation of Babylon come in and they lay siege to Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, which means basically the army surrounded their city walls. And they wouldn't allow any food, any supplies to come into the city. And they basically starved them out. And then eventually tore down the walls that protected the city. And they took it over, and they took all the influential people and they deported them out of their city, making the city weak and desolate, full of darkness and despair. And so when Isaiah writes that the government will be on the Messiah's shoulders, they're thinking that there's going to be a conquering avenger come in, much like a political leader who's going to save them from their oppression. Eventually, that's what they come to believe. A lot of us today can probably relate to people wanting to make a political figure much like this, where they lay their hope and put all basically their I guess hope for the future in, thinking that if a certain person is in power or a certain person gets elected, that we're going to be God's going to make things right, or maybe they think that he's already made things right. You can look at it all kinds of different angles, but that's not what Jesus came to be. He didn't come to be this political savior, but he did come to be a conquering avenger over sin and death. And so when we see that he is the wonderful counselor, he is based on his life and his Holy Spirit being with us once we receive Jesus. He gives us counsel when we need counsel. How many times do we need counsel that's good? Because let's just face it, we're surrounded by foolishness, am I right? Sometimes we're the ones who are spouting foolishness, and we need wonderful counsel. And that's one of the great gifts that we have from God's word on this side of things now, 2,000 years since Jesus came. But Jesus was going to be our wonderful counselor, and he is our wonderful counselor. He is a mighty God. He had the power to beat death by coming and living his life and then resurrecting from the dead, beating sin and death. He was the conquering avenger, mighty in strength. He is the everlasting Father, which means he has no end. And for me, my earthly father isn't here anymore. To know that Jesus is my everlasting Father, that's a powerful statement. For those of you who maybe you have a father that doesn't meet your expectations, you can know that God can do that through Jesus. And then last but not least, Prince of Peace. Do you ever find yourself wanting peace? If you're a parent or ever been a parent of toddlers, you understand what it's like to want peace. Or teenagers for that matter. They're kind of the same. Or if you are a teenager, you know what it's like to have all this noise in your world at school and on the social networks, and just sometimes wanting peace from it. Jesus was the Prince of Peace, which makes him the boss of peace, which makes him the head honcho of peace. And Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, is writing about him 700 years before he comes. So if we fast forward now from 700 years before Jesus came, which was 2,700 years ago, 2,700 years ago from right now, we're at the first century. So 2,000 years ago, Jesus is about to come. And I can imagine from the time that Babylon came in about 600 years before Jesus and up until the first century, that people felt a lot of despair and distress. They were under occupation from other nations. And so on the scene pops a man named Zechariah. And Zechariah was a Jewish priest. And we're going to be in Luke chapter 1, and we're going to start in verse 5 in just a few moments, reading about Zechariah and what God did in his life and to prepare the way for Messiah. But Zechariah was a guy who he was righteous. He was known as righteous. He was also old. Like when he woke up in the morning, his knees probably hurt. His back probably hurt. If your back ever hurts when you wake up in the morning, you probably understand what it's like to feel old, or your knees. Or maybe you can't see. I remember the time I went to the eye doctor not that long ago, and they're like, I think you're going to need readers. Like, what? Like, to me, that was like crossing a line. But Zechariah was old. And so in Luke chapter 1, verses 5 through 7, we see this. In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah. Now, this is significant because Herod is the ruling power at this time for the people of Judea, or the Israelites. And Herod is under the Roman Empire's jurisdiction, and he is the one that's large and in charge, and that they would want freedom from. So he was the king, and the priest was named Zechariah. Zechariah belonged to the priestly division of Abijah, and his wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them are righteous in the sight of God, so they did what was right. They observed all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. So like these are like your cream of the crop people, which would make the next verse very interesting, because for this culture, what I'm about to share with you would have been seen as a curse. And so it wouldn't line up with this. If you do good, good things are going to happen to you, which is not true anyway. But there is belief in the Jewish culture that if you follow the law, that God was going to bless you with a bunch of positive blessings. And while you reap what you sow, quite oftentimes, even when we do the right thing, we know that life isn't easy and that bad things still happen to seemingly good people. We live in a broken world. So in verse 7, we see what the problem was. They were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive. Now, this is substantial because in that culture, it would have been thought that for a female not to be able to have a child, that she was being cursed by God. So if they were like the cream of the crop type people, for them not to have a child would not line up with this false understanding of if I do right, good things are going to happen to me. We just know that's not true. But that's where they're living. And then Luke goes on to write that they were both very old. So again, their knees hurt, their back hurts when they got up in the morning. They moved around a little bit slower than they did when they were younger. And so we're going to pick it up, continue in verse 8. Zechariah, his priestly division was on duty. And he was serving as priest before God, and he was chosen to go into the temple and to burn incense. And the reason he would burn incense is because they would say these prayers to God. So the priests representing the people would go into the temple and they would pray prayers to God, burning incense at the same time, with the expectant hope that God would hear their prayers, that he would be honored by this sweet smelling incense. And then outside of the temple, we see that there's a group of assembled worshipers praying outside. And because of their desperate situation, I imagine that there were a lot of tears, people crying out to God, crying out for Messiah, being under an oppressive rule for about 600 years, hoping that that political Messiah popped into the scene to be their conquering avenger, which is what makes these next verses so interesting in verses 11 through 20. And I'm going to kind of talk through this kind of fast. But what happens next is, to me, mind-blowing. The angel of the Lord appeared to him. Okay, that's mind-blowing in of itself. And you guys know what happens when an angel shows up. He's going to have a message from God. And people are going to be terrified because of the power that angels bring when they show up. So he appears, and Zechariah sees him. And Luke writes that Zechariah was startled and gripped with fear. I imagine if you were praying and an angel popped onto the scene, you might be startled too. So he's praying, people outside are praying, incense is going up, angel, boom. And he says, don't be afraid, Zechariah. Zechariah is probably thinking, that's easy for you to say. Your prayer has been heard. Now, I'm in verse 13 right now of Luke chapter 1. This next part of the verse gives you an indication of what Zechariah was praying for. And I want you to get this in light of what I've already told you about Zechariah. He writes, your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son. Wait, she's barren. And she's old. Old people aren't supposed to have babies. But Gabriel says, your prayer has been heard. So we know that Zechariah in his old age is praying still for a child. And Gabriel pops on the scene to say, Elizabeth, your wife is going to have a son. Your prayer has been answered. Your belief, your faith in the Lord is being honored. And then he says, you're to call him John. And then he starts to talk about what John will be. He will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he's born. What this means is he's going to be set apart as a special instrument of the Lord. And he will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God. And this next verse, I absolutely love here in verse, I think 17. And he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah, which was an Old Testament prophet, to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. Let's see, in the middle of all this rebellion and this darkness and this distress and this despair, families were being ripped apart. And what Gabriel is saying to Zechariah is that your son will bring families back together. Your son will be responsible for life-giving connections happening in families. Can you imagine that being said about you or your offspring? And especially when it shouldn't be possible. And then he goes on to say, or Zechariah goes on to respond with a question. How can I be sure of this? He states what we already know. He says, I am an old man and my wife, he doesn't call her old, notice this. He says, my wife is well along in years. Zechariah is a smart man. He doesn't call his wife old lady. If you ever heard somebody call their wife old lady, that's not good. I don't think that's a very good way to refer to your wife. But Zechariah, he's smart. He says, my wife is well along in years, not calling her an old lady. But what I like so much about this right here is that Zechariah is so honest. He prays a prayer that requires faith, yet his doubt is right there existing simultaneously. It's possible for you to have faith and doubt existing simultaneously, even if you've heard otherwise, because we see it right here in Zechariah as he's interacting with the angel Gabriel. And the angel then says, oh, I'm Gabriel, and I stand in the presence of God, and I've been sent to speak to you and tell you this good news. And now, Zechariah, you're going to be silent and not be able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time. And so Zechariah, who is this priest who is down the road in age, is going to be put in timeout with his words. Now, when my kids were growing up, we used to do something called putting people on mute. So we couldn't like literally mute them. We wouldn't do anything psychotic to mute them, but we would say, guys, you need to be quiet. What's coming out of your mouth isn't good. We don't want to hear it anymore. And if you're a parent, you understand that. You don't have to be a parent to understand that what's coming out of someone's mouth you don't want to hear. If you're a friend or you have a job, you understand sometimes what people are saying you don't want to hear anymore. And so Zechariah he was silenced. And so he just had to sit back and wait for it to happen. He couldn't tell them everything that had happened to him, which I think actually made what ended up happening with John the Baptist coming on the scene and paving the way for Jesus to come and be the Messiah of the world, made it just an incredible story. What we know is that eventually Jesus does pop on the scene because John paved the way for him. That God's plan, even going back 4,000 years before right now, was for John to come on the scene and to pave the way for the Messiah. And in the middle of them having these great expectations, and I say them being the first century Jews under their oppression, God had a plan. And this is what's true for me, and this is what's true for you. God has a plan for you in the middle of your distress, in the middle of your despair, in the middle of a time when it's dark, because you may not be experiencing despair or darkness or distress, but if you are, and you eventually will, you need to know that God has a plan in that. And as we wrap up our time here right now, today, I want to challenge you with this idea: to trust in the promises of God and the hope of a better tomorrow because of Jesus. Because of Jesus. We didn't really talk a lot about Jesus coming on the scene today, but John eventually paves the way for Jesus, who ended up becoming the conquering avenger, not just for the Jews, but for you and me over sin and death, to prepare us a way to be back with God for eternity, the life beyond this life. And so because of our trust in him, we can hope for a better tomorrow. So the question I want to ask you as you think about the expectations we talked about today, maybe where you are, is where do you need to rest in the promises and hope that Jesus brings as Christmas? I'm going to ask it one more time. Where do you need to rest in the promises and hope that Jesus brings as Christmas? Because we already talked about, you can't change other people, but you can change yourself based on your trust in him, because he came to make our lives greater than what we can do on our own. That's just how good our God is. As we wrap up our time here today, I want you to remember, Jesus is God with us, Emmanuel. He is our wonderful counselor. He is our mighty God and everlasting Father and Prince of Peace when we receive him. And then when we receive him, we then can live that out where other people can experience his power through our lives. How could this Christmas be different with the family and friends you're going to interact with if Jesus were the one leading your life because of your trust in him? In 1 Peter 1, verses 3-6, Peter writes about the hope that comes with Jesus. And he's writing this on the other side of Jesus's resurrection from the dead, beating sin and death and being that conquering avenger. And I'm going to share these verses with you leading up to the last song we're going to sing this morning called Living Hope. But in 1 Peter 1, verses 3-6, Peter writes this, and Peter being a disciple of Jesus. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming of the salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. In all this, you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have to suffer grief and all kinds of trials. You see, when we trust in him, he helps us to navigate the distress, the darkness, and the trials, because Jesus is our living hope. Would you join me in prayer? Jesus, we thank you for showing us how you've been at work even before we were on the scene. Even before a lot of the people we've talked about today were on the scene, that through Abraham and through his descendants, you had a great plan for all nations. And we thank you for the promises that you keep and the hope that you give when we trust in you. So I pray you would give the men, the women, the kids who are with us today, the courage to trust in you and to put their hope in you. May this Christmas be the best one yet because of who you are. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.